So you want to make your own Renegade Space Marine chapter. Let's see if we can help you with that. Now, it's worth mentioning right off the bat, homebrewing Renegades is homebrewing Space Marines on hard difficulty, comparably homebrewing Chaos Space Marines being easy difficulty and Loyalists being medium difficulty. Reason being that Chaos Space Marines only have a few guidelines to follow in homebrewing, given that the nature of Chaos and Chaos worship is, well, chaotic, and tempts you to do slightly weirder things with your writings. And Loyalists being medium difficulty, as there's a fairly large amount of guidelines to follow, but being the poster boys, the information surrounding the makeup of a chapter is pretty common knowledge, not to mention the plethora of guides out there.
Homebrewing Renegades, however, is a bit more difficult. Now, before I go into why, we're going to put a disclaimer again as usual. When it comes to homebrewing, you are free to make whatever you want in any way you see fit. We're sure the majority of Games Workshop sales reps would be more than happy to tell you that you can do anything you want as long as you're buying the miniatures. And we're going to tell you that they're right. This hobby is for fun, first and foremost, so if adhering to the guidelines we're about to put forward causes you suffering, just throw them in the bin and have a good time.
However, with that being said, there are two kinds of homebrews. Homebrews for yourself and your friends, and homebrews for consumption and critique. Now, for the purpose of this video, and making a believable and interesting Renegade chapter that fits well into the setting, we're going to focus on the latter. However, like mentioned before, if you do this just for fun, be as loose with these guidelines as you like. No one should really stand between you and your enjoyment of the hobby. But before we get into the real meat of this video, I wanted to let you all know that we got our very first sponsorship, a video which we will show you now.
Hey man, I gotta use the loo.
Occupied.
What's taking you so long, man?
Well, Aaron, I'm glad you asked. I'm playing Raid Shadow Legends. The Monkey King is now a new legendary hero in Raid Shadow Legends, and they're giving him away totally free for a limited time. Immerse yourself in this epic free-to-play fantasy RPG with its captivating storyline and intense online PvP. Explore a visually stunning fantasy realm featuring over 800 champions across 15 playable factions, rally orcs, knights, elves, and a diverse array of creatures to overcome any obstacles in your path. Raid is available on Android, iOS, and PC. You can download and try the game for free using the link in the description or by scanning this QR code and receive some amazing heroes. And this is only the first bonus, with plenty more to come. When joining and using promo code Monkey King, you'll gain access to the legendary Sun Wukong, who is free for a limited time if you follow the link in the description, and redeem him using the promo code in the first 72 hours. This mythological character is incredibly powerful in-game, stealing opponents' buffs and using his Staff of Wonder to ignore a huge chunk of an enemy's defensive stats, as well as dealing splash damage to other foes. To redeem your promo code, simply tap the tab on the top left-hand side of the screen and select the promo codes option. Once in there, type your promo code and smash confirm, and enjoy your new legendary Monkey King.
Not only that, if you join now and redeem the promo code Monkey King in addition to Sun Wukong, you'll also receive the Lightsworn, a powerful epic champion, as well as Juliana at level 15, a super strong epic boss-killing character. Download the game for free via the link or through the QR code and receive all free heroes today.
Moots, what the hell are you doing in the bathroom?
Shh. Don't worry about it.
So, we're going to break this video up into a few segments as usual. 1. What is a Renegade chapter? 2. The Loyalist Chapter. 3. The Fall or the Villain Arc. 4. The Renegade Years. 5. The End Goal. And 6. Some canon examples.
So, what is a Renegade Chapter? A Renegade Chapter of the Imperium of Man's Adeptus Astartes is a chapter in what can usually be described as a transitionary period. A period in which they are neither acclaimed by the forces of chaos, nor that of the Imperium. Typically, a Space Marine chapter on the run either from something or to something. A chapter that is always characterized by its dwindling non-replenishable resources, warriors, and the gene seed. A chapter that will be experiencing either a crisis of faith, submission to a new faith, or both, culminating in internal civil war, reducing the chapter's dwindling strength even further.
Due to actions undertaken in vain or objectives failed, this chapter could be declared excommunicate traitoris and become renegades for any number of reasons. Narrowly avoiding death, they'll travel the stars with a singular purpose, usually revolving around simply surviving, with a handful of likely final destinations, the single most likely being extermination.
In short, a Renegade chapter is neither Loyalist or Chaos affiliated, despite all Chaos Space Marines technically being Renegades. But it instead is a chapter that is usually totally alone in the galaxy, making its way toward our predominantly horrific outcomes.
So, starting off, we need to talk about your chapter as Emperor-worshipping Loyalists. Now, to cover this section in detail, we could link you to our Make Your Own Loyalist Chapter video, wink wink nudge nudge, as, of course, a Renegade chapter's origins can be pretty important. However, what is also curious is that in some circumstances, you can actually forgo this segment altogether. You see, a well-written Renegade chapter doesn't actually need any information on their original chapter status, as that info could well be lost to time or just be totally unnecessary, although we would encourage you to delve into it at least a little bit. Having footnotes on your chapter's original state, personality, heritage, combat doctrine, notable campaigns, and allies could very much come in handy when putting together your Renegade Space Marines.
That being said, what were they like before they became renegades? Were they already on the Inquisition's radar for some slightly less than above board practices? Perhaps they had a chapter master that followed his own agenda, creating a slow descent into excommunication. Maybe they were loyal to an absolute fault, but simply failed an important mission. Remember, the High Lord's reasonings for declaring a chapter as traitors or renegades can be insanely petty. The High Lords are not the most forgiving or even logical bunch.
The amount of detail you invest into this section can be as much as you want. You can create an entire Loyalist homebrew that you have spent years working on, and then after a particularly pivotal campaign or event decide, fuck it, they're renegades now, so long as you invest an adequate amount of attention to detail in fleshing out the how and why of the excommunication.
Which leads brilliantly into our second segment, the Fall, or as I like to call it, the villain arc. Now, even though we mentioned that you could avoid this segment altogether, we'd still encourage you not to, as to me at least, it is one of the most pivotal parts of a Renegade chapter. It's also, curiously enough, an incredibly excellent excuse to write your very own short story. What was it that caused the fall? Was it the aforementioned failure of a key battle? Perhaps the chapter sided with a Xenos faction to survive a terrible battle? Or, God forbid, did they side with a Chaos-aligned faction out of pure necessity?
There are examples of this throughout the lore that you can look to. If I recall correctly, there's even a canon tale about a strike force of Marines from the Imperial Fist successor, the Fist's Exemplar, siding with the Iron Warriors out of a similar kind of necessity during the War of the Beast, only to be welcomed into the ranks of those Iron Warriors when a group of Black Templars confronted them about not turning on the Iron Warriors after the battle. So remember, the fall of your chapter into excommunication doesn't have to be a glorious or an inglorious failure or traitorous act, but instead could simply be a result of trying to survive.
On the other side of things, it could be simply a refusal to work for or with the Inquisition, much like that one story with the Space Wolves where the Inquisition tried to have the Sons of Rust eradicated, only to eventually fail. Now, whilst this doesn't mean that the Space Wolves were necessarily renegades at that point in history, if the Sons of Rust didn't stand their ground and metaphorically prove themselves and then instead fled to survive, they almost certainly would have become excommunicated as renegades.
But as we mentioned before, it could be due to a chapter master's selfish goals, or perhaps some other member of the chapter. In fact, my first ever homebrew was a Renegade chapter, and whilst I made a huge number of rookie errors, I was pretty happy with it in the end after a ton of retconning. Their fall consisted of the first company captain essentially starting a long-planned coup under the chapter master's nose, whilst he was away on a mission, leading to a civil war within the chapter, leaving half the chapter dead and the other half split between loyalist renegades, blamed for the deeds of the first captain, and the other half full on turning to chaos.
Now, let's talk about the Renegade Years. This will be the most important part of your writing about your homebrew, where all the magic will happen. During this time, your chapter will typically have two objectives, and the first and most important one will always be trying to survive, and the other is something of your choosing. But we'll circle back to that in a moment. As your chapter is now cut off from the Imperium and no friends to Chaos-affiliated forces, they will for the most part be entirely alone in the galaxy. The most important thing to remember here is that your chapter will also have no access to resources or a resupply of any kind. The Adeptus Mechanicus will not help them. There is no bribe or ulterior motive that could lead a Forge World or Subforge to ignore the order of Excommunicate Traitores and risk their own extermination to help what is going to be ostensibly a dwindling, broken chapter of named traitors.
So you might be asking yourself, how does a Renegade chapter replenish its numbers? Well, it doesn't. Remember, a Renegade chapter is almost always stuck in a transitionary period. We'll touch upon that in the end goals section, but for the purposes of the Renegade Years, in short, they're kind of fucked. A dead Marine is a permadeath, a number that cannot be replenished. Now, you could use a leap of logic and talk about how they could steal Gene Seed and could implant it into new aspirants. But the time it takes to create a single Space Marine is way longer than the time a Renegade chapter would be able to survive before it reaches its end goal, the segment we'll talk about shortly. And without the help of the many medical arms of the Administratum, even with a surplus of times, it would be a tenuous suggestion at best.
There are ways a Renegade chapter can replenish its resources and armory, however, and this plays into one of the best ways to create the Renegade chapter's combat doctrine, hit and run salvage operations. There's little odds of a Renegade chapter actually successfully defeating a Space Marine chapter or a Chaos Warband in open battle. However, they are still superhuman Space Marines. Boarding actions and void warfare against Imperial transport vessels containing shipments of just about anything will always be possible. And following the same MO against Space Marines companies that are weakened from conflicts, returning from campaigns is a high-risk, high-reward way of resupplying on Space Marine weaponry, armor, and ammunition. Though this actually plays pretty nicely into your chapter's second objective, as previously mentioned. If your chapter's second objective is to return to the fold as Loyalist, these kind of hit-and-run resupplies would be off limits. Your chapter will be relegated to whatever they have on hand at the time of their excommunication.
However, if your chapter instead had no intention of returning to the light of the Emperor, and its secondary objective is instead to become zealots, following the command of a charismatic chapter master, then hit-and-run attacks on Imperial worlds and vessels would be very much on the menu. This is also a pretty good time to talk about your chapter's leadership. And of course, your chapter's fall should absolutely have a hand to play in this, because the truth is a lot of chapter masters, if declared excommunicate traitoris, would actually submit themselves and their chapter to summary execution due to their unshakable loyalty.
So if you're going the route of a Loyalist Renegade chapter, you'll need to think long and hard about how they justify remaining Loyalists without submitting themselves for extermination. Perhaps the leadership or chapter master sees what they believe is an easy route to redemption by undertaking a campaign once failed, or instead the chapter's leadership is so arrogant that the idea of submission is simply anathema to them.
Which brings us comfortably to a Renegade chapter's end goal. Now again, being a Renegade chapter is, as mentioned, typically a transitionary period for a chapter, so you gotta ask yourself, transitionary period to what? Well, there's 4 main destinations with different rarities, and of course, your chapters fall, how they orchestrate themselves, and what befalls them during the Renegade Years will of course have a role to play in this. So we've got Eventual Extinction, very common. Falling to Chaos, still quite common. Penitence, rare. And finally, Perpetuity, incredibly rare. So let's tackle these one by one. Eventual Extinction is by far the most common outcome. Now, if you're writing or considering writing a Renegade chapter, please do not be afraid of this option. So what if your chapter's going to die? Death is the ultimate fate of all Space Marines. No matter which way you spin it, Space Marines are a resource to be spent, and this is simply a way of embracing that mantra.
Whilst it might not seem particularly grand or fun to homebrew a chapter this way, we'd encourage you not to be so quick to judge. Creating a chapter's narrative knowing that extermination is their ultimate fate gives one a very freeing feeling. Over time, seeing your characters slowly get picked off until the chapter eventually goes out with a bang is a lot of fun.
And is actually the route I had taken for the Renegade Loyalist side of my aforementioned first homebrew. They were called the Carrion Engines, and without going into too much detail, over the last 3 years of writing them, they have fallen further and further into disarray, with only 2 named characters and barely half a company and a broken strike cruiser remaining at this point. It's been so much fun being able to put my hand up whenever a friend has needed a victory for one of their homebrews, giving me an opportunity to have the Carrion Engines take part in yet another battle where they're doomed to lose more and more.
Going with Eventual Extinction really gives you an opportunity to shine a light on the grim dark heroics that recent Space Marine novels set in 40k as opposed to the Horus Heresy have been really lacking. Showing off a chapter's grim demise allows you to really highlight the brotherhood and bonds shared between its battle brothers. Every individual life suddenly carries so much more importance and weight, and truly gives you the opportunity to write with the most condensed essence of the grim darkness of the far future.
Anyways, on to Falling to Chaos. This one is actually pretty self-explanatory, and again, we could just straight up link you to our Make Your Own Chaos Warband video, as it covers everything you need to know. Except here, as Renegades, there is typically one key difference. A Renegade chapter Falling to Chaos can often be characterized with a very slow descent, as opposed to a key event that results in the outright worship of one of the Chaos Gods or Chaos Undivided.
Where with making a Chaos Warband, your chapter could be from a Legion, or a Loyalist chapter turning traitor, or after a overexposure to Chaos. Here, with a Renegade chapter, you'll more likely once again experience that slow decline. Without access to resupply or resources, a choice will eventually need to be made as to whether or not a chapter will succumb to Chaos worship to bolster their dwindling selves. Making a pact with the heretic tech adept Stark Mechanicus will increase the odds of your Renegade chapter's survival, but also guarantee their fall to Chaos.
Or alternatively, 10 to 20 years on the run can lead to such a massive resentment of the Imperium that the motives of Abaddon the Despoiler and his acolytes could very quickly seem like a much more relatable endeavor. I mean, if the Emperor abandoned you despite you loving him and doing your best, you may learn that Grandfather Nurgle's love would never ever abandon you under any circumstances, or instead seeing the strength and structure of the masses of warbands that submit to the Black Legion or the Red Corsairs would appear to be a just cause to take vengeance against those who banished you.
Now moving on to the more difficult ones to write, we have Penitence. The reason this is so immensely difficult to write is because the Imperium at large does not forgive. A Space Marine chapter would seldom be able to achieve an objective so important and so grandiose that it could overwrite a chapter's perceived transgressions. And even if it could, the delay in informational communication would have the chapter waiting decades to actually be informed of their return to the fold.
In regards to Penitence, another thing worth mentioning is a Penitence Crusade. These crusades have historically been designed to be the suicide mission equivalent of a crusade. Why summarily execute a chapter when you can have that chapter killed whilst also contributing to a goal for the Imperium? Now, if on a Penitent Crusade, your chapter would technically not be Renegades, but fully Loyalist instead. However, it's worth mentioning here quickly that writing a chapter on a Penitent Crusade brings a lot of narrative and creative enjoyment that you can explore, drawing similar parallels to writing a Renegade chapter that will eventually face extinction. So if writing the demise of your chapter is something that appeals to you, consider doing a Penitent Crusade instead and writing your chapter's demise that way.
Ultimately, one should be very careful when writing a Renegade chapter that you intend to eventually return to the fold, for they can do no harm to the Imperium. They can never defend themselves, they can only run and hide, which makes for a very difficult narrative to execute. There won't be any inquisitorial deus ex machina here. Consider narrative points revolving around immense sacrifices, assisting Loyalist forces on the brink of destruction, being betrayed constantly. Hell, maybe even look to the fate of the Soul Drinkers chapter for inspiration, who found redemption in Extinction and had their chapter reincarnated with new origins and gene seed during the Ultima Founding to honor the deaths of their fallen forebearers.
And finally, the most difficult one to write, a Renegade chapter that ends in Perpetuity. Now, this essentially means a chapter that continues on to be Renegades in, well, perpetuity. In all my time investing in homebrewing, I've only ever met one homebrewer that has created a homebrew that had attempted this with any narrative success. His entire chapter, known as The Regulators, was centered around this notion of piratic scavengers that specialized in void war. However, he eventually decided after a few years that they would make more sense eventually falling to chaos. And now, as they are today, they have begun to worship Slaanesh. For now, they are still renegades, but as his narrative evolves, the seeds of chaos have been sown, and their inevitable fall is, well, inevitable. For this to work, your chapter must be selfish beyond all reproach, and have written characters that exemplify this characteristic. A chapter that is truly repulsed by both the Imperium and Chaos alike. A chapter that will gladly form temporary alliances with both Chaos and Imperials, only to betray them the instant it's convenient. A chapter that will at all times see how weak it is in open warfare and abandon its allies sooner than it would attempt to betray them. A chapter that truly exemplifies the notions of selfishness. And even with all this in mind, it will be immensely difficult to justify without abusing the law's restrictions, so be gentle in your writings, be slow, methodical, take advice from your peers and those who have opinions on the law that you trust. Because in a lot of ways, a chapter that's Renegade in perpetuity is going to need to be not just immensely cunning, but also immensely patient.
They will have no secondary goal, as we talked about in the Renegade Years segment. Their only goal will be survival at all times, and anything that helps them. A chapter with no resupply, a chapter with no true allies will be ramshackle and on the verge of death at all times, and will know it. Not all of their betrayals will go well. Not all of their quick escapes will succeed. Writing a chapter that is a perpetual renegade will be an exercise in writing at least one defeat for every one victory, and exploring the nature and concept of a group of space marines hopelessly alone in the galaxy.
Now, we wanted to quickly talk about just a couple of canon examples within the setting to draw inspiration from or look to for guidance. A chapter following a few mentioned archetypes such as Loyalist Renegades, Internal Civil War, Eventual Extinction, and Penitence through Death. The Soul Drinkers deserved a lot more narrative investment in my opinion. However, they do a good job of showing off from start to finish what one can expect with a Renegade chapter, especially a Renegade chapter that's doing its damnedest to remain loyalist.
It's also worth looking at the various successionists of the Badab War, with the Lamenters, Mantis Warriors, Executioners, and Astral Claws all becoming Renegade chapters working together for over a decade, with the first three all eventually undergoing Penitence crusades to return to the Emperor, and the Astral Claws turning to full-on Chaos worship, becoming the Red Corsairs with spatterings of Marines from all three prior chapters included. Although it's difficult to use the Badab War successionist as an example, as the Badab War happened in a vacuum, and it would take a single homebrewer several years to create writing for a Renegade chapter or group of Renegade chapters that could match the narrative depth of what happened during Badab.
Now, whilst we don't have a lot of information on them, the Flame Falcons are a good example that highlight the origins of a Renegade chapter. Declared excommunicate traitores by the Inquisition for a gene seed malfunction that caused the Marines to appear set ablaze, with the Grey Knights sent to exterminate them, what few survived ultimately went into hiding. Or similarly, the Relictors chapter that were declared renegades during the 13th Black Crusade for using Chaos weaponry against the forces of Chaos. Once again, the Inquisition using the Grey Knights to all but obliterate them, escaping into the Eye of Terror.
A theme that's arising here that may be worth taking note of in your writings, and a contributor as to why renegades are so difficult to write, is that the common trope that homebrewers often lean on being that the Inquisition have a specific use for them, so they're allowed to get away with X, Y, and Z, simply won't work with renegades. Not just the Inquisition, but literally any Imperial body. In fact, the only time a renegade chapter will have Imperial allies will be in situations most dire. And with that in mind, one can expect said Imperial bodies to turn on and attack a Renegade chapter once the battle is done, lest they themselves be destroyed, much like the Fist exemplars that fought alongside the Iron Warriors.
Anyways, thank you so much for watching. We've started work on our homebrew review series, so expect the first one in December. And if you don't know what that is, we're making a series in which we take your homebrews, give them a dramatic reading, go over them codex style, followed by a casual review of what we like about them, what we might have done differently, and really try to highlight some of the best community works that have gone under the radar. So, once again, if you want us to look at your homebrew, jump in our Discord, link in the description, and if you're enjoying our content and want to help us steer the direction of it, please take a look at our Patreon. And finally, thank you so much to our patrons: Oxy, Ollie Wally, Purple, Rion, Voldestarian, Niklas, Barban, Blackhall, Bobby Coolpop, The Croc Enthusiast, Dark Cannibal, The Gaming Storyteller, Frank, Jury Rigged Hobbies, Jordan, Josh, Mr. Hanson, Sir Walton, Steph, and Voxcast Nowhere. Thank you all so much. And finally, one big thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Please feel free to claim your Monkey King champion by using the promo code MonkeyKing through the QR code or the link in the description.
Hey do.
We'll see you next time.